Greetings all. Um, I hope this video is finding you all well and safe and whole. Um, in this video or in this lecture, I want to follow up on some of the themes that we explored in our last class, looking at queer and non-binary and non-heteronormative genders and sexualities. So I want to follow up with some of that. And also, I want to kind of underscore and condense some of the points from our most recent set of readings about cultural hybridity. Got the train in the background. So I want to share a PowerPoint with you, and I also want to kind of give some more context and introduce you all, or maybe remind you all of some other thinkers and other movements and work that have been looking at cultural hybridity, cultural fusion, cultural exchange, cultural appropriation, and kind of like what historical moment you might say that we are in right now, and kind of some of the forces that have helped bring those moments together, or bring this moment together. And I also want to provide some background for some of the thinkers who were mentioned in several of our readings, and some of the background perspectives that inform some of these thinkers. So, all right. So I actually want to start with a sit. You're welcome to join me, or you're welcome to fast forward. But I like to start with the sit. It helps me get grounded. And I'm really trying to do this in the spirit of what we do at Naropa. So if you want to join me, please do. And I'm going to read just a small section from Gloria Anzaldua as the kind of object of our sitting, and we'll go from there. So she says, our psyches resemble the border towns and are populated by the same people. So as we sit, you might consider what your internal borders are. Maybe what the borders are in your physical space, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your city, and how those borders live in you. Are they membranes of exchange? Are they barbed wire fences? Are they rivers? How do those borders live in you? Okay, so let's begin. Start with the share screen. So this presentation, calling it Mestizas, Imagined Borders and Cyborgs, Histories and Perspectives on Cultural Transmission, Hybridity, and Appropriation. So we looked at Paul Miller, DJ Spooky's work on the multiplex consciousness from his book Rhythm Science. And I'm going to just kind of start off by just reviewing some of the work of the thinkers that we were studying. So I'll kind of go through each one. So he talks about our sense of self as being multiplex or multiple, and as kind of in this sort of digital era that we're living in, or the digital media that we have a lot of our social relationships through. And I feel like this is especially pertinent right now in this COVID moment. We represent our identities electronically. We put together music that represents our identities. We represent ourselves through text and through video and through photo and through imagery. And right, this is the whole field of social media. We're telling stories about our lives and telling stories about who we are. And so Miller says that, you know, and he uses the medium of the hip hop DJ or the electronic musician as his metaphor, because he's both a scholar and a DJ producer. He says that the medium of electronic music, or hip hop music in particular, is built off of fragments, and it's built off of old records, old recordings, old code that is assembled into new pieces of music and made to speak to the current moment. And as a result of building ourselves, our sense of self, or projecting an identity off of these different fragments of media, we kind of develop this like self that's made up of a lot of different cultural backgrounds. And he almost describes it as like attention deficit disorder, right? It's like we jump from one thing to another. So anyway, the self is a collage, it's a mix, it's an assemblage, and it's a piece of art. And he saw African-American culture as a precursor of a lot of postmodern and digital culture, in the sense that, you know, he spoke about after the slave era, even the English language was kind of a bunch of fragments as far as Black people's experience and taking on of it. It was a bunch of fragments that we kind of reconfigured to make it make sense to us and speak to our experience, or be a vehicle through which our experience could be shared both with one another and in resistance to the dominant white society. So we also looked at Gloria Anzaldua's work and her a chapter from her book Borderlands, and she speaks about La Mestiza, right? The Mestiza person as someone who lives on the boundaries of multiple cultures. And she herself is identifies as Chicana, right? That's not Mexican, right? That is US born, multiple generation Mexican blood, or ethnically Mexican person, right? So a lot of times Chicanos don't speak Spanish, and they haven't for generations. They're Americans, they've lived here, right? But she, in her experience, the Chicano culture is not accepted as part of the greater American culture, or particularly the Anglo-white version and vision of that culture. So she grew up in the borderlands of South Texas, and she really kind of, as you all saw in the reading, assembled that border identity into a creative space. And she saw it as a kind of liminal space, right? In the sense that it was a sort of in between and a non-defined place. It was a crossroads. And I don't know if y'all have heard a lot of the kind of stories about the crossroads. The crossroads is a dangerous place. It's a mysterious place. And so, you know, she saw the mestizo self as it was a perilous identity, right? But it's also this really powerful place of bringing together peoples and translating between peoples, and the translator as actually a healer, right? And she also spoke to the ability of queer folks to be kind of cultural bridges. And because queer folks actually exist in all cultures, and they're dealing with very similar, in many cases, very similar forms of oppression in many different cultures. So she spoke about the mestiza, and the mestiza isn't just about translating between cultures and carrying the blood of different cultures. It's also translating between different states of consciousness, right? It's also an epistemological thing, right? It's rational, it's creative, it's imaginative, it's dream work. You know what I mean? It's the cultural ontologies of indigenous peoples and of the kind of rational academic Anglo world, you might say. So we also looked at Joanna Kadi's work. And my little picture here is kind of cutting folks off, so I'm gonna just move. Right, and she's asking this whole question about, how do we have ethical connections interculturally rather than culturally appropriating one another's culture. And she spoke a lot about this sort of apolitical nature of the New Age. Okay, and I think this is really relevant for Naropa and for Naropa students, because from the outside, I think a lot of people are going to see what we do as, oh, this is New Age, right? This kind of idea that everyone is on their own spiritual adventure and everyone is their own spiritual master potentially, and everyone is free to make up their own spirituality as they see fit. And she really saw that as kind of apolitical and ignorant, and spoke about her experiences, reclaiming her parents, or one of her parents' Arab culture, and her kind of experiences with a lot of white people, women in particular. She talks about cultural appropriation as privileged people basically grabbing segments and artifacts of other people's cultures for their own possession, and not really having the knowledge of where they come from and who the people who are doing the grabbing are in relationship to those they're taking from, right? So she kind of presents us with these questions. What is this cultural artifact that you want to take part of or possess? Is it dance? Is it movement? Is it a prayer? Is it a spiritual tradition? Is it a hairstyle? Is it a piece of clothing? And what situations are those people dealing with, right? What power dynamics exist between your group and their group? And she's particularly looking at white to nations and communities of color, but she also looks at the kind of horizontal oppression that happens between communities of color, right? And she also talks about multiculturalism, and is multiculturalism really a new strategy for commodification? Is it just a new selling tactic, right? So talked about Joanna Kadi's work, or we read about her quest here for cultural reclamation and her navigating cultural appropriation. Okay, so someone who was mentioned in the Multiplex Consciousness article is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was an African-American sociologist and scholar and philosopher, mid and early 20th century. And he really coined this phrase, double consciousness, that Paul Miller speaks about. And in his vision, double consciousness was this fact that African Americans lived basically as Africans and as Americans, right? We lived in two worlds. We lived in the world of kind of the oppressed and segregated world of the Jim Crow era and of the enslavement period. And we also interacted with the larger white world, which kind of considered itself America. And so part of the experience of African Americans was this kind of, Du Bois almost describes it as a sort of schizophrenia of asking where we belong. Are we actually part of the United States of America? Or are we our own kind of separate world? And that split actually produced this incredible tension in Black people and in Black culture. And that actually was this kind of psychic strain. And this is similar to what Anzaldua is talking about with the borderlands. There's this kind of psychic strain of being in between. And Du Bois said that, you know, it's oftentimes destructive for Black people as individuals and as a culture, but that we've actually also developed this capacity to kind of straddle both worlds and to be part of both worlds and to have a vision that comes from two eyes, right? And our vision actually comes from two, and it creates one perspective, and it gives us the ability to see depth. So Du Bois kind of saw that double consciousness as this ability or this potential ability of Black people to see a certain depth in American culture that white Americans could not actually see. Wow, this is really interesting. I'm having more tech issues. Somehow or another, when I blow this up, it just freezes. So I'm going to pause again. Okay. So, and part of this double consciousness, part of it is this kind of toggling of identification. And Du Bois spoke about this way in which Black people couldn't see themselves from the eyes of white people and judge themselves from the eyes of white people and judge themselves from the kind of systems of anti-Black racism, and how this results in this self-hatred and this concealment. And it's really a struggle to come into that place where the double consciousness is actually a gift and a benefit. Because oftentimes it is this form of self-hatred and this form of trying to remake ourselves in a white image, when, you know, that in a way is a sort of psychic and cultural suicide. So not an easy place, these in-between places and these borders. You know, we spoke about in our last class, like why are we so attached to identity? Why are we so attached to labeling ourselves and putting ourselves in boxes? And we kind of got down to this level of ego, right? You know, what is it that we're protecting? And each of our authors, well, Anzaldua and Kadi in particular, really speak about the tension that exists in these liminal places, and the fear that exists from not knowing and not being able to say where you belong. And it's not just psychological, it's actually a real experiential social issue that people have. If you don't belong in this community, are you welcomed in this community? Do people fear you in this community? Do they persecute you in this community? So another thinker that was brought up by Gloria Anzaldua was this gentleman, Jose Vasconcelos, and he actually had run for president at one point in his life, and this was shortly after Mexico revolted against Spain and succeeded in throwing off the Spanish colonial power. And so part of his work, he was a philosopher in addition to a would-be politician, and part of his work was he was trying to articulate an identity and a kind of a philosophy and an ideology for the Mexican people. And he saw that a lot of the European colonists were basically working under the premise of white supremacy. And white supremacy is about purity. It's about whiteness. Okay, it's about being spotless. It's about non-mixture of races. Okay, and it's about the purest of the pure, right? And this isn't something that's exclusive to white supremacy. You find it in a lot of aristocratic societies and a lot of aristocratic thinking, that the aristocrats, the rulers of that society, are the people that most exemplify whatever ethnic trait that that society deems is the most important. So Vasconcelos looked at Mexico, and he looked at the Mexican people, and he saw that the Mexican people were, they were made up of the original indigenous peoples. They were made up of the Spaniards, and sometimes the Germans, and sometimes Jewish folks. They were made up of Africans, enslaved Africans, or the descendants of the enslaved. Okay, and even there had started to be at that time a lot of movement of the Japanese and the Chinese into, and the Filipinos into the West Coast and into Mexico, you know, to engage themselves in the mining labor, like we were learning about towards the beginning of the semester when we were looking at Indigenous peoples' history of the United States. So Vasconcelos said, it's impossible for us as Mexican people to be pure. So that's not what we should go for. And he actually saw it as this kind of, you see, at this time, people's thinking about race was really still caught up with the manifest destiny idea that history was sort of, was being moved by God, right? Or being moved by these sort of higher forces. And he believed that the coming together of all these peoples was basically destined, and that it was a strength that the Mexican people should look at as a strength, and they should see themselves, right? He talks about, you see here in the quote, the fifth era of the world. Well, he saw the first era as black, the second era as red or indigenous, the third is yellow or Asian, and the fourth is white. And he said that the whites saw themselves as the final conquerors of the world. And he was like, our work is actually to like undo conquest. Like our conquest is to non-violently accept the cultures and contributions of people all over the world and actually create this sort of fifth race, which he called La Raza Cósmica, or the fifth race, or the cosmic race. And he's actually one of the intellectual parents of the Chicano movement that later happened around the time of the Black Power and Red Power movements in the 1960s. So, and his view was also that this cosmic race would be, that their leading idea would be about art and beauty, and that they would come about their great discoveries and create this sort of vision of a world that was based off of beauty and based off of love. And so Anzaldua sources him as one of her kind of founding thinkers for her idea of La Mestiza. Now, in this picture here, you can kind of see the four races surrounding this person in the center who's supposed to be the product of all the races. And this painting was done by Diego Rivera, and he actually worked with Jose Vasconcelos, because they were trying to create a visual history of the Mexican people through muraling, or visual mythology, you might say, right? And this is what Anzaldua was also speaking about, the creation of this new kind of mythos. But Vasconcelos really, again, he was part of this time period where there was this very essentialist view of race, where skin color equated to certain types of characteristics. And so there's a lot of racism in his work. There's a lot of anti-Blackness in his work. There's a lot of sexism in his work. And he couldn't even conceive of, I don't think at that time, queerness as a hybrid category. You know, still very much a masculinist, and still very much caught up in these sort of manifest destiny ideas of race. So Anzaldua, she really brought in, she built on top of Vasconcelos' idea of the cosmic race, and really brought in this dimension of the female and of the woman and of feminism, and really of queerness as this kind of boundary breaking, or this moving across and exchanging information across boundaries. And she saw her idea of La Mestiza as like, it was a feminist revolution in the sense that it was a revolution of softening, right? We're not hardening our boundaries and getting stronger and protecting ourselves from the other or aggressing on the other. We're recognizing the ways in which the other is actually a part of us. and we're not disowning anything. We are actually seeing how all the threads of culture, whether we are part of the conquered or the conquering, the oppressed or the oppressor, how they all actually filter through us and how they can actually all become a source of richness in life, right? So she says, for the mestiza, rigidity is death, right? There really has to be this like flexibility and this capacity to accept the many different cultural, racial streams, and really even gender identities as well. So she even at one point speaks about bridging not only between human societies, races, genders, languages, but also even between human and extraterrestrial, right? So she kind of conceives of La Mestiza again as this cosmic um, identity, or this cosmic bridge between identities. And so I just thought I would put this painting in here. This is actually by Spanish artist Samuel Tutulas, Spanish as in Barcelona. So I just thought that was kind of fun, put it in here, right? This cosmic race. So someone whose work I think actually really exemplifies a lot of Anzaldua's ideas right now is Fabiana Rodriguez. She's out of Oakland, and you guys, you've probably seen her art everywhere. Really kind of, she contributes a lot of her art to social justice movements, movements around queerness, around feminism, and especially around this issue of migrant labor, the US-Mexico border, and undocumented folks. So she has this image here of the monarch butterfly and this slogan, migration is beautiful, right? So she's talking about the ways in which a lot of indigenous peoples in the southern part of what is now the United States and the northern part of what is now Mexico, previous to the Anglos, right, the United States, previous to the Spanish, that a lot of the indigenous peoples would actually move with the seasons, north and south. You know, they kind of moved to the warmer climates, and they would actually follow kind of the monarch butterflies that actually also migrate. And at this time of year in Colorado, they're on their way back, right? So she's saying, look, there is this pattern that people have, indigenous peoples in North America have moved along north and south for centuries, and actually was disrupted by the Spanish, and it was disrupted by the Anglos. And the movement of people across the US-Mexican border predates both the United States and the current nation of Mexico. And so she's kind of arguing in a way for almost a sort of trans border consciousness, and a kind of, I can't use the word citizenship, because a citizen is someone that has certain legal obligations and rights in a nation, right? But so she's sort of asking something that's a little bit beyond or underneath or weaving through the nation state, right? She's saying there's a movement of people that is actually older. So Fabiana Rodriguez, if you haven't heard of her work, she's doing awesome stuff. Oh boy. Oh, this is quite frustrating. Part of what we're seeing here is that there are that we've created these ideas and these identities that are bound to geography and that are bound to place. And that part of the way that colonization has worked is it's been about, first of all, conquest of different places and the displacement of peoples. But it's also been about making up stories about different peoples and creating conceptual categories around different peoples and distinguishing between, like one of the ways that white supremacy works is it distinguishes between itself and all others and places itself on a higher pedestal than cultural others. And so this gentleman here, Edward Said, he's originally Palestinian. He's done a lot of work around what he refers to as Orientalism. He kind of coined this term Orientalism. And Orientalism is really looking at the ways in which the Western world in their imperial ventures, right? And when the British moved into India, okay, when the various European powers fought the Ottoman Empire of current Turkey, right? Even going back as far as the Crusades, and again, this came up in our reading the first indigenous people's history of the United States, that as these different European operations moved into different parts of Asia, there was this whole idea that the East and West were like fundamentally different, and that the West was rational and that the East was mystical and irrational, and that the West was dynamic and that the East was sluggish. And so he talks about this whole way that the Western world constructs the East as this other, and then defines itself by constructing the East as other and non-self, right? So, but he says really a lot of our ideas about the Oriental are really, and I should say this part of the world's ideas of the Oriental are really they're actually the Western people's ideas. They're not the reality of the Orient itself. Okay. And that there's this whole kind of exotification of Asia, you know. And really when we say Asia, we're actually talking about a massive part of the world that's made up of many different cultures and languages that are very distinct. And so to even group them together in a way is kind of false. It's kind of a myth. It's kind of an imagined border. So Edward Said talks about Orientalism, and you can see this in some of Joanna Kadi's writings too, when she talks about Aladdin and her experience there. You can see it also in her experience of white perceptions of Arab culture, belly dancing, and so forth. So there's this idea that the East is mystical and it's romantic, and I think this is something that we really need to pay attention to at Naropa when we make this claim to be joining the spiritual traditions of East and West, and letting the sparks fly. We really need to be aware of our own standpoint and our own positionality and the power that we are bringing into kind of potentially appropriating Eastern teachings and then being the purveyors of them in the Western world and establishing a name and really being able to profit from them. So I'm not saying necessarily that what Naropa is a cultural appropriation, but I'm saying as people who are trying to bring together teachings from different spiritual traditions, we got to be awake to this kind of stuff. So Edward Said, he might be someone you are interested in checking out. This is his picture from this period of European art, late 19th century, early 20th century, Orientalism, right? And this whole way that the Orient was depicted and romanticized and exotified, and how these pictures kind of communicated to a lot of people who were in the Western public and were not part of these kind of conquering missions or exploratory missions. They kind of created this vision of what the East was. And again, most of this is based off of Western fantasies, right? And there's this whole kind of really sort of patriarchal, sexualized gaze that happened there too, right? This really sort of powerful male gaze that was communicated through this Orientalist art. Another one that's worth mentioning here is Homi Bhabha, and he's originally from India, and he was one of these kind of like founding theorists of post-colonialism. And post-colonialism is really, it's a philosophical movement, it's a political movement, it's a literary and artistic movement, and it's a cultural movement, and it's really coming from a lot of nations in the global South and the Third World, formerly colonized nations who are really after they had thrown out or overthrown their colonists, right? Gandhi and the Satyagraha movement pushed India, or really appealed to the English conscience to leave and release India, right? So, but even as they stepped out, they had left such a huge imprint on the Indian people, right? They had introduced new customs and new language and destroyed customs and destroyed language in some cases. That basically Homi Bhabha's problem was, how can we regain our original culture? We've been so overlaid by this imperial culture that we can't go back to some kind of pure India. We actually have to go forward. And he really coined a lot of this thinking around cultural hybridity. And then when he got really deep into it, he saw that actually India itself is not one monolithic thing either. It is made up of many, many languages. You know, we talk about Hinduism. Hinduism isn't one religion. It's actually a set of a lot of different spiritual practices. It's similar to what happens in Black Africa, and similar what happens in the Americas, in terms of there are certain unifying or repeating threads, but there are also very different religions, practices, rituals, and so on that are being called Hinduism. So Homi Bhabha really saw that like there actually was no original Indian culture to begin with, and that culture is always in flux, it's always changing, and it's always a hybridization of many different elements that are being brought together. So his view was that the colonized, they had their original kind of cultural mix, and then this new cultural mix that came in on top of it via the colonized impression. And then after having broken free of the colonized, they were in this third space, he called it. And he said that this third space is actually where the creativity of culture happens, where the freshness of culture happens. It's actually being uncertain, and it's being in an ambiguous space. This is, again, similar to Anzaldua's ideas. So another here that I'm kind of jumping now, kind of back to some of our studies in queer theory, that another I want to bring in is from a very different angle is Val Plumwood, and she is an Australian ecofeminist, and she has done a lot of work looking at the philosophical constructions of the Western world. And in one of her books, she talks about what she has this thing she calls linking postulates, where she really examines these different, like, kind of basically dualistic thinking in the Western world. And she takes it all the way back to Plato and the Greeks, right? And she says that they kind of came up with this split, and they split the world into this binary thinking, right? Culture, nature, civilized, wild, male, female, human, animal, rational, irrational, black, white. And in these binaries, it's not like the yin yang, right? We're used to seeing the yin yang and thinking of balance and this kind of like complementary duality, right? She's saying dualism is this belief that one half of reality, if reality is in fact split in two or binary, one half of reality is, or one half of the binary is always superior to the other half of the binary. Okay. And so if you look on the left side of that column and the right side of that column, you can see what we place more value on, or what the Western world and what the kind of patriarchal thinking that has arisen from this part of the world, what we place more value on and what we devalue, right? And she also talks about denied dependence, right? And she says that in a patriarchal society, men are reliant on the labor of women in the home. They're reliant on domestic labor. They're reliant on child rearing. They're reliant on taking care of the sick. And that there's all this labor that women are performing. They're reliant on the creation of clothing. There's all this labor that women are performing that is unpaid, and it is actually the substrate of all human society. But it's actually denied as being important. It's less important than the political. It's less important than business. It's less important than war, right? It's not viewed as art, right? This is also this kind of like disjuncture between high and low culture. So Plumwood says this denied dependence, it's this dynamic in patriarchal cultures, this dynamic between men and women is seen in all these other aspects of culture, and really come back to dualistic thinking. And dualistic thinking is one side is better than the other, not there are two halves that make a whole, and that each is equally important and each has different qualities that are interdependent on one another. So another one, you know, this image here, this is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'm like, wow, you guys are like, well, where is he going with this? Kind of far afield. The Epic of Gilgamesh, right? It dates back to anywhere between 2150 and 1400 BCE. And, you know, Epic of Gilgamesh, ancient Mesopotamia, current day Iraq approximately. And this story is sort of one of the stories that a lot of the rhetoric of Western civilization is based on, right? This is seen as one of the first texts, literary texts that kind of establishes Western civilization. And in this story, if you all are unfamiliar with it, Gilgamesh is this kind of warrior king. He's probably got one of his parents as a god, or maybe both of them. And he's sort of the semi-divine hero entity. He's like one of these first heroes. And he's a hero because he's physically strong, and because he can conquer, and because he can protect and defend his people. And so he's the king of this kingdom, Uruk, and he's defending Uruk against the wild forces initially. And the wild man is represented here by this guy Enkidu, this creature Enkidu. And so Gilgamesh goes out, they say there's this wild man terrorizing us. He's part of nature and he's terrorizing us. And Gilgamesh goes out, they wrestle, and they almost tie, but Gilgamesh defeats him, and eventually they become friends. And then Enkidu dies, and it leads Gilgamesh on this whole quest to find one of his ancestors and actually learn why people die. And first he tries to seek immortality, and he ends up he fails. But he kind of comes back to his city with this sort of renewed meaning, having kind of had this encounter with death. And a lot of thinkers, including this gentleman, William Irwin Thompson, talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh is like, one of the reasons it's important is because you have this city and you have this wall built around the city. And the wall is this border between the civilized and the natural. And that border and that like distinction, boundary creating between the civilized and the natural is one of the kind of fundamental thought structures. And it's not just a thought structure. It's like we said in the beginning, it's one of the, it is like the, like we said in the beginning, everything that is happening on the inside is happening on the outside. And what's happening on the outside also is happening on the inside. That's what Anzaldua is saying. So as we create these borders internally, we create them externally. So Gilgamesh creates this wall, and that wall, according to some thinkers like William Irwin Thompson, is actually a symbol of the ego. All right, so we're talking about, again, why are we so invested in these boundaries? Why are we so invested in ego? Why are we so invested in differentiating ourselves and protecting ourselves against the other? So I just thought I'd bring that in there, one of these old stories of Western civilization. And part of the reason I bring that in there, because this is another one I want you all to be aware of. Donna Harraway, she's an ecofeminist, and really she calls herself a cyber feminist. And a lot of her work really revolves around looking at the relationship between humans and animals, and actually the artificial boundary that we've put up between the human and the animal. And she finds that when there are a lot of studies are being done on animals, they find that we ascribe things like cognition to ourselves, or intellect, or imagination, or feeling. And actually, we're finding more and more that not just the apes, but a lot of other animals are capable of these kinds of things that were ascribed to humans only, and that separated and elevated humans above animals. So Donna Haraway speaks about, she came out with this book in the early 80s called the Cyborg Manifesto. And she really is speaking about, she's saying these boundaries, we've created these boundaries between the human and the animal, between the mind and the body, between the spiritual and the carnal. And that those boundaries are actually, they're continuums at least. And maybe they're even something messier than a continuum, and in her view, messier and maybe more beautiful than a continuum. So she says, we should learn to take pleasure in the ambiguity that comes from boundarylessness. And in addition to seeing that there's a continuum between humans and animals, or that we actually aren't as different or are a kind of animal, she also says, if we look at our tools are actually extensions of our own bodies. They're actually extensions of our minds or our nerves. It might be more apt to put, they might be extensions of our nervous system. And so in a way that we're actually cyborgs. And she's saying that we actually have to create a kind of ethics around how we work with technology and how we create technology, and looking at technology's relationship to larger ecosystems, right? Right? How do we start to develop a technology that's integral with our environment? Or how do we recognize the fact that technology is already wrapped up in our environment and is having effects that we are either conscious of or not? So, and the picture here is by Oakland artist Joshua Mays, and he is a kind of Afrofuturist artist that really works with multidimensionality, works with representations of Black people, of Black female, and also of like a blurring of boundaries between body, imagination, technology, the natural world, and so on. So I just thought I'd put that in there. Check out Joshua Mays, cool stuff. So Donna Haraway, Cyborg, you can see examples of this in a lot of Western art and a lot of Western storytelling. And one is, I don't know if y'all have ever seen the movie Metropolis. It was like one of the first like motion pictures, and it's really fascinating if you haven't seen it. But it really it depicts this this civilization that has completely split itself off from nature and really has these sort of two classes. And one class lives under the ground, and another class lives above the ground in this like hyper technological city. And that they actually construct this like robotic woman, and it's really deep. It's really complicated and problematic, but it's something y'all might be interested in. But I think it's just one of these early depictions of like woman as, or the female as like artificially constructed, and like this idea that patriarchy wants to make a female that's better than nature. The second picture here is this is a Pygmalion, right? And this sculptor Pygmalion, it's an ancient Greek myth, and he was sculpting this image of a woman, and then he falls in love with the woman, and then the gods grant the woman life, right? And then they live happily ever after. But again, you see this idea of like making nature better, and like reason making a more perfect nature. So, and then the last one here is an image. It's actually from India also, and it's an image of the Chipko movement, or Chipko movement. And this was a movement primarily led by women that was trying to protect forests in India in the 70s. And actually, you can see it here. These women are the original tree huggers. That's where that term tree hugger came from. And a lot of this movement in India inspired people around the world to adopt similar tactics to stop their forests from being deforested, chopped down. So the Chikpo movement, tree huggers, And I think part of this movement kind of grew out of the Gandhi movement, the Satyagraha movement. They also used nonviolent techniques, and they understood that like their livelihood was really bound up with the forest, and their lives and their culture was really bound up in the forest. And this is the kind of like, you know, Harraway is talking about cyborgs in the sense of like the kind of popular sense of like Terminator maybe, but she's also and really talking about cyborgs as this understanding that we are actually made up of what is around us, and that the boundary that we put between our bodies and the bodies, the other bodies around us, animate, inanimate, and inanimate, is actually an illusion. Okay. So kind of getting to the close here. This gentleman here, this is Teilhard de Chardin. He was a early 20th century Catholic priest, and also he was a paleontologist. And he was one of the people that helped discover Peking Man. And Peking Man was one of the skeletons, the skeletal remains that was used by evolutionary biologists to kind of verify that human beings had actually evolved from apes. And so he had this sort of dual problem of being a Catholic and believing in this genesis and creation by God at once, but also having the actual evidence that human beings had evolved out of animals, and we're part of the animal and evolutionary world. And he really saw that like evolution was moving through us as well, and that it was moving into a lot of our tools and a lot of our technology and a lot of our language. And so in addition to there being a biosphere, an atmosphere, a hydrosphere, which is the ocean, a lithosphere, which is the solid landmass, he also felt that there was a noosphere, a knowledge sphere, okay? And that human beings were creating with information, with language, with technology. And he really actually believed with soul and spirit, we were creating another layer of life on the earth that would interact with and transform the other layers. And so he saw our movement across the globe. And he said at one point, human history, we spread out from a center, and we had sort of like endless horizons to move into. And now we're at a point where we've wrapped around the whole planet, and we're encountering one another again, and we're actually undergoing what he called a social compression. And all these different groups are being forced to come together. And so he says we can either be forced to come together, or we can recognize our situation and choose it, even though we're being forced. So it's like you're in the ocean, and you can either get slammed around by the waves, or you can learn how to surf them. And so he had this idea he called planetization, right? And this is human beings spreading out all over the globe and creating this thinking network all over the globe. And I think the planetization is a cool idea to differentiate from globalization. Globalization is really about it's essentially the economic conquest of the planet by capitalism, right? It's essentially about creating an ease of capitalist business transactions worldwide, and exporting production to different parts of the world. And so there are a lot of folks that see globalization as a kind of final stage of colonialism or imperialism. And Teilhard's vision of planetization was actually not necessarily economic, right? He saw it as primarily spiritual, as primarily a cultural evolution that was part of a larger cosmic evolution. So just thought I'd put that in there. So if we are, in fact, as Teilhard de Chardin and a lot of these other thinkers, or if we are, in fact, living in a time when human beings are that used to be in different and disparate cultures are coming together, and that there's this time of fusion and exchange, and maybe even hybridization and the creation of new kinds of cultural situations. What are the ethics of how that's done? You know, how do we do that in a way that is respectful? How do we do it in a way that's knowledgeable? How do we do it in a way where we are not exploiting one another or following the patterns of exploitation that we've been studying in this class? You know, what does cultural exchange look like in a planetary context? You know, what's the difference between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation? How do we differentiate? And how do we preserve the uniqueness of different cultures even as we are kind of being pushed into this unity? That might be another question that folks have. So, and it's not just a cultural push, right? When we're looking at queer theory, and we were looking at the kind of breakdown of binary thinking. It's not just the cultural boundaries that are melting, it's also boundaries between genders, and it's also boundaries between our bodies and other entities or bodies in the world. So yeah, what are the ethics for that? And again, I think this is an especially important question at Naropa, where we are, you know, you remember this banner in Lincoln that has the wheel of the Dharma in the center and these various spiritual symbols for various spiritual teachings around it. And the idea there is that, you know, the Buddha has invited these other teachers to dinner, or these other traditions to dinner, and they're in exchange. Okay, so now these spiritual traditions are all spinning records together, right? They're all starting to play their teachings and their practices at the same time and actually find ways to make some kind of shared music or experience out of them. So, you know, I don't know if any of you guys like hip hop or electronic musics of various types, EDM, but you know when a mix is good and when it isn't. You know when it works and when it doesn't work. And I think that there's a science to that. If not a science, there's an art to it, and there's an ethics to it. And at this point, a lot of it is feeling. I think you can feel when you're experiencing cultural appropriation, or when you're doing it. I think you can feel it a lot of times. It feels icky. It feels awkward. So, you know, there's this term these days that's being used, interspiritual. And they're saying that more and more people don't identify with a particular religious tradition. They identify with multiple religious traditions. They practice teachings from multiple religious traditions. Or just like Paul Miller was saying in terms of music and a mix, they create their own sort of mix of spiritual traditions. And this is what Kadi's saying about the new age. Like, this is one of the things that's happening in the new age. In new age spiritualities. And I don't think it's really that. I don't think it's a matter of simply rejecting it. And I don't think it's a matter of simply accepting it. I think we have to be awake. We have to have a critical lens. We have to learn respect. And I think respect means different things to different peoples and even different individuals. And this is something that Kadi spoke about, right? You can't just go out and get the blessing of one person from this tradition to practice it. And we also have this problem. We're receiving so much information over the internet. We can go to libraries and read about this tradition. We can go to this workshop and that workshop or that church, and they're all in the same street sometimes. So this is the real situation that we are in. And yet it is fraught with conflict. It is fraught with unjust and inequitable power dynamics, right? It is full of one group being able to take from another group, profit off of it, and actually make a name for themselves, while that group that actually created it and actually knows how to use it better in a lot of cases, right? And you go back to Kadi's reading about the drum, right? And then the group that takes it actually becomes known for it, right? And you take that, especially in a capitalist economy, where each of us is kind of pushed to being our own unique brand, right? Everyone wants to take yoga and do their own thing with it. Take yoga and mix it up with somatics. Take yoga and mix it up with live painting, right? Take yoga and mix it up with, you know, what is this, suspended dancing. And again, I'm not dissing on all these things. I'm just saying that these patterns exist. And this is the kind of milieu that we're all in, especially at Naropa. And I think these questions are really important for us in particular, because part of the training of this school, I think, is to help us to become people who are holding space for the sacred. So what are the ethics around interspirituality and around cultural exchange? How do we develop a strong sense of ethics around that? So I hope that we can explore some of these questions in our discussion with Darcy Adi from Youth Passageways in our next class on Tuesday. I don't think we'll be able to get to the bottom of it, but I think that we might, yeah, I hopefully we can see what this looks like in practice with organizations and with individuals that are kind of exploring this interspirituality and exploring ritual and practices from different contexts or from different cultures. And what does it mean to be our particular identity, whether it be white or whether it be female or whether it be Black or whether it be Latino or wealthy or what have you? What does it mean to be our particular identity and come into relationship with a spiritual practice or cultural practice that does not come historically from where we come from? So the last bit here, I just kind of want to do something different. We spoke a lot going back to Vasconcelos and this kind of creation of this cosmic race, to DJ Spooky's idea of this multiplex self, and like using cultural fragments to create new identities and to articulate oneself, to Val Plumwood and Donna Harraway, and this idea of like the cyborg being a mesh between different types of materiality, to Teilhard de Chardin's planetization. So check this video out. I'm gonna play it here. It might sound funny here through my computer, and if it sounds funny, just check it out on YouTube. It's actually a collaboration of a American hip hop producer, Nightmares on Wax, a Brazilian artist, João Pombeiro. Not sure I'm pronouncing that name right. An indigenous activist and speaker, Kuthali Vasquez. Probably butchering that name too. Speaking of cultural awkwardness and exchange. Anyway, it's a collaboration, and I think it kind of depicts this interesting, if we go back again to this idea of Gilgamesh and this sort of differentiating and bordering between the civilized and the wild, or the indigenous and the technological. It kind of depicts this interesting sort of three-step process of indigenous, civilized, or industrial, and then maybe something that could come after that and maybe combine elements of both, or maybe be something altogether different. So I'm gonna try to play it here. If it sounds whack on your speakers, feel free to find this video and play it on your own. And feel free to comment on this lecture. I apologize for the tech difficulties. I'm learning my way through. Feel free to comment on this lecture in the discussion forum or any of the readings. If you want to get creative, you could record your own Zoom response to this lecture or your own question and post it in the discussion forum. Why not? Just play with it. But feel free to comment on this. Thank you for watching it, and hopefully we can take this and bring it into our discussion in class with our guest, Darcy Adi. So peace, blessings, and yeah. Wow. All right. Well, I'm just going to stop the video now And I'll leave you all to actually find that on your own if you like.